The definition of state capitalism is when the state sector oversees and controls private enterprise, when private capital is in the hands of the state rather than private individuals, placing the ownership of capital, the means of production, from one private group onto the other. In a more broader sense, one could argue that the influences and interactions between the business enterprise and state sector is state capitalistic, with the merging of both sectors coming in different ideological flavors, where the interests of the state and private enterprise are often mutual, creating an unholy alliance between the two. The governmental structure of a fascistic state is one where the state sustains private capitalist enterprises and takes a directive role over them to fulfill the economic and ideological goals of the fascist party. It seeks to boost private capitalists while also using these enterprises to fuel the state's supremacy. Private enterprise would control production, but it would be supervised greatly by the direction of the state. It rearranges foreign trade so that domestic capitalists have an easier time selling their goods abroad and blocking imports so that they can sell to their own people because the government has prevented imports from coming in through enacting tariffs. The government deregulates, removes all of the regulations that are costly to capitalists, while enforcing the regulations that help to enhance them. The economy is boosted by an enormous expenditure on the military, as military service is made mandatory. This is the militaristic side of fascism. They do this to further control the population, while supplying a workforce and army to help them in their war cause. This also helps to stimulate and support private enterprise. This type of state capitalism, where the state plays a directive role over private enterprise, is called Fascism. It's an economic doctrine in which the state plays a strong directive role as opposed to a merely regulatory or non-interventionist role over a capitalist market economy. Derringe's policies often include indicative planning, state-directed investment, and the use of market instruments, taxes, and subsidies. To quote R.J. Overy, in the long run, the movement was moving to a position in which the economic new order would be controlled by the party through a bureaucratic apparatus staffed by technical experts and dominated by political interests, not unlike the system that had already been built up in the Soviet Union. The core ideological focus in fascism is palingenetic ultranationalism, a return to an ethnic purity that will cause a rebirth of a nation as a whole. So in this way, the fascistic party and its control over the state is supposed to represent the people, specifically the chosen race or ethnicity considered to be superior and best representative of the nation as a whole. The end goal of fascism is to restore to a golden age through this racial purity. Fascistic state capitalism can be described as using the private enterprise to further the goals of a national rebirth, fueling the ruling party's goals and ideals onto the society. The exchange of fulfilling state orders to become stronger while retaining continual subjugation to ideological control. Tons of neo-fascistic groups have popped up after World War II, with many trying to distance themselves from the term fascist to try and seem different from it. Terms like identitarian, third positionism, and national Bolshevism, otherwise known as Nazbols. It's interesting to note that many try to pass as syncretic, something that isn't left or right, rather something born out of both. However, this attempt at neutrality through reconciliation falls flat when one simply looks at the political policies and structures advocated by these people. I like to call this appeal to neutrality by reconciliation as the syncretic narrative. Trying to appeal to white workers while also perpetuating sexism and racism goes against the benefit of the working class. You can't both advocate for workers' rights while also advocating for the genocide of the peoples. The proletariat is not simply limited by skin color. You reinforce a centralized structure when maintaining social hierarchies, thereby your populism is made empty by your policies. From a structural and historical analysis, I consider left-wing politics as an appeal to decentralized organization, while right-wing politics is an appeal to centralized organization. So the idea of fusing both is a contradiction used by those trying to pose as something less than despotic. Ethnostates, a state that is ethnically homogeneous as other ethnic groups are expelled and or cleansed to achieve this. The idea behind this is that racial issues are the prime reason behind all the bad things happening in the world, so the proposed solution is to just kick anyone out who doesn't conform to whatever racial identity is being imposed. Obviously, this mindset is highly irrational and fallacious, as racial identities themselves aren't as clear-cut as thought. Rather, race is more of a social construct. Turns out genetics is extremely complex, that to impose some kind of categorization onto the population based on supposed genetic similarities is absurd, given most recent scientific studies suggest you could be more related to a supposed different race than someone who is of the same supposed race. Also, every person's genetics are already kind of mixed up to begin with, and trying to impose purity leads to really bad results. There's a reason why inbreeding is not considered ideal in a species' development. Also, all those things like starvation, crime, homelessness are issues regarding socio-economical things. Turns out that hoarding all the resources for yourself turns everyone else extremely desperate. Neoliberal state capitalism, what is sometimes called corporate state capitalism, is the state of economic affairs going on in neoliberal countries, where the business enterprise uses its wealth to create a vicious cycle of influence through implementing governmental policies to create more wealth, thereby giving it more influence, always keeping the state alive for when the market crashes so that tax money can be used to rebuild the businesses considered too big to fail. In this sense, the state acts as a repository used by wealthy elites to keep themselves in power, while the rest of the public fits the bill on their reckless behavior. Socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor, or privatizing profits and socializing losses, which is the practice of treating company earnings as the rightful property of their shareholders, while the losses are treated as a responsibility that the society should shoulder. In other words, the profitability of corporations are strictly for the benefit of their shareholders. But when the company fails, the fallout, the losses, and recovery are the responsibility of the general public. In the United States, there is an attempt made to appear as though the country is democratic by having two political parties, the Democratic Party and Republican Party. Third parties do exist but hold little to no power. Both of these parties, however, support business interests. I go into this more in my violence video. One could argue that party supremacy like we see in fascism is also maintained in neoliberal countries, that both Democratic and Republican parties are the same party and maintain control over the state, but unlike fascism, an illusion of democracy is maintained by having the ruling party split into two. Although technically, if a popular movement was powerful enough, it could have someone from outside the ruling party's interest elected through the representative democratic process that is set up. Remember, any democratic process is a concession of state power, but that concession of power is regained through practices such as manufacturing consent. Oftentimes, corporate elites will entertain fascistic regimes when they feel threatened that the population will revolt against them. The arrangement is made between capitalists and fascists to where fascists guarantee that they'll keep their power so long as they kneel to fascistic interests, by giving the fascists the finance and industrial support they need to gain power and influence. This arrangement happens in foreign policy, where right-wing terror groups are funded and propped up in foreign countries. The hope is that the group will gain control over that state so that it will then act in the interest of the state that helped fund their rise. The United States of America is a hugely infamous example of this kind of behavior. Neoliberal state capitalism, corporate state capitalism, can be described as corporations using the state to maintain and continue its own power and growth, using the state as a repository for bailouts, subsidies, and tax cuts, establishing corporate welfare and financialization of the economy to increase profits while displacing production. There is also something called anarcho-capitalism, or as I like to call them, corporatocracists, or people who favor corporate republics. Instead of keeping the state alive, anarcho-capitalists kill it off in favor of quote-unquote pure capitalism. However, since capitalism is a centralized structure that requires private property and a monopoly on violence to exist, this means the corporation will become a state in themselves. Instead of being a nation state, they will be a corporate state. Corporate republics that without self-regulation will collapse or return to an old exchange of neoliberal ways where the state bails out the corporations through taxation. Although in this case, the funding to rebuild themselves would come from pensions or other business-related funds that are extracted from the employees or kept towards their retirement. This type of government is mostly theoretical and depicted in a lot of science fiction media, like the recent Outer Worlds, where interplanetary governments are run by corporations. Often used historical examples are the East India Company, Republic of Florence, and the International Association of the Congo. The traditional flavor of tanky state capitalism is defined by the governmental structure of Stalin's Soviet Union and Mao's China. One-party states where the political party maintains supreme and central control. A centrally planned economy is used to control the nationalized industries. Central planning is when the economy's decision on what to produce, how to produce, and for whom are taken by the government in a centrally planned bureaucracy. The single-party system here is owed to Lenin's concept of democratic centralism, in which a vanguard party is meant to represent the workers. The vanguard party is said to be composed of professional revolutionaries, and would be elected to leadership positions by the mass party membership. Thus, the organization would quickly include the entire working class. However, the party's function and structure separates itself behind a filter of bureaucracy and mythologies that are meant to persuade the people that the centralized power is in their favor and acting in their interests. And to reinforce this is a mythology surrounded behind the party, creating a cult of personality, not unlike the cult of personality surrounded by Hitler and Reagan. The state's monopoly on the means of production is used as an excuse as being necessary, with opposition being quelled to further consolidate state power. Authoritarian practices are excused as being necessary in order to achieve a communist future. Non-traditional Tanky economics can be defined as drifting away from central planning and into Derengist direction, as seen with Deng Xiaoping reform of the People's Republic of China. So Tanky state capitalism can be described as using central planning, or at least Derengist economics, to further the ideological goals of the ruling party, in this case to create a transition into communism, or at least what the state defines necessary for that transition. The end goal is to create a communist society through the transition of an authoritarian state. Communism is usually defined as a stateless, classless society. It's important to note that establishing a communist society is greatly debated, primarily between the libertarian and authoritarian sides, with libertarian socialists preferring decentralized methods to achieving a communist society. Tanky states often try to give the appearance of being egalitarian, although racism and homophobia exist in the PRC and DPRK, which, if we were to be honest, North Korea is little more than a monarchy. With the PRC's oppression of Muslims, Tibetans, and the Turkish ethnic group known as the Uyghur, to name a few. Tankies will often excuse or deny the atrocities performed by these states. Common arguments against any who try to bring up these things is that CIA propaganda, things like the Xi Jinping re-education camps and the infamous 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre don't exist. Class reductionism seems to be a common trope among those who are apologetic to these tyrants, ignoring intersectional hierarchies except for economic class, even though racism and sexism are a huge part of economic stratification. You do nothing for the movement of socialism by ignoring the means by which people are oppressed, especially when being neglectful to their needs. As social hierarchies are interconnected and mutually reinforcing, if you're not careful, you'll end up recreating these hierarchies within your own revolutionary activities, as patriarchal hierarchies and many others have existed long before capitalism. It is my opinion that right libertarians, right authoritarians, and left authoritarians are all right-wing authoritarians committing to the same general structure of authoritarian state capitalism. And two of these, party politics, are supreme as they function as bureaucratic institutions to help to maintain their own power without accountability to the people. In a corporate republic, the shareholders board would act as the political party of the state, carrying out propaganda that supports their authority and the corporate hierarchy as a whole. The only ideological framing that explicitly rejects centralized structures like capitalism in the state is left libertarian political ideologies like anarchism. Keep in mind the structural hierarchy of a state and capitalist enterprises are very similar. Both are centralizing with a top-down hierarchy, focusing on maximizing control and power while isolating and strangulating those below, killing democracy. One could note differences between these three ideologies by looking at ideological imagery and policies that focus more or less on certain social hierarchies like race, but this video is primarily focusing on a central structure of these, with those shallow differences acting as different flavors of the same thing, the different flavors of state capitalism.